Hello and welcome. I am Mark Wilson, Director of the Caroline Marshall Drawn Center for the Arts and Humanities in the College of Liberal Arts at Auburn University, housed at Pebble Hill, the historic Scott Yarborough House in Auburn. We are delighted to host this program today on artist George Fuller, with whom we now have a special connection resulting from a generous gift from David and Frances Robb of Huntsville, Alabama. Dr. Sarah Burns, Ruth N. Hall's Professor Emerita at Indiana University Bloomington, will discuss Fuller's travels to the South in the 1850s. Ray Ratigan, curator, will discuss materials available for researchers at the Memorial Hall Museum in Deerfield, Massachusetts. Dr. David Robb cannot be with us today for the program, unfortunately, but we will be able to show you an image of the George Fuller drawing that those of you in Auburn and beyond can view in person at Pebble Hill. So we are delighted now to have Dr. Sarah Burns to talk to us about the artist George Fuller. Welcome, Sarah.
Thank you so much, Mark. Thank you for having me, and thanks for giving me the opportunity to revisit George Fuller, on whom I really haven't done any research for like 30 years, but it's been fun getting to know him again. So here you see him as a young aspiring artist, and there he is, a very old artist. And he was born in 1822, he died in 1884. He was raised on a farm in Deerfield, Massachusetts. He wanted to become an artist. His parents, of course, opposed it, but eventually he prevailed. And as with many, many American artists during this period, his early career was devoted largely to portraiture. And that required him to become an itinerant on the road in search of business. He did a sweep of upstate New York. He studied painting with, oddly enough, a sculptor named Henry Kirk Brown. And he also took some lessons at the National Academy of Design. In the 1850s, he was based in New York. He made his first trip to the South in search of portrait commissions to Augusta, Georgia, late in 1849. And then two successive winters, 1856, 57, and 1857, 58, he traveled to Montgomery and Mobile, Alabama, with a painter friend, Edwin Billings. And they basically just set up shop and went around looking for portrait commissions. I guess in Montgomery, the legislators were in session, so there were plenty of prospects. So you've got this interesting situation of Yankees in the deep South. And I don't think anyone was more Yankee than somebody from Deerfield, Massachusetts with Boston connections. And Boston abolitionism, of course, was really heating up at this time. So in Alabama, in Montgomery specifically, Fuller developed an interest in the lives and labors of enslaved people, both in town and on the plantations. And his diary and his letters contain interesting descriptions of slave baptisms that he witnessed. He talks about women laboring in the field, they're plowing behind mules, they're digging with pickaxes. He witnesses and describes slaves loading cotton in riverbank towns, and he attended at least one auction of enslaved people. In Montgomery, during this winter of 1857-58, he filled a sketchbook with 78 drawings, of which 30 depict slave and plantation scenes. And these are typical. Ellis, the adult male, is really strikingly individualized. There's nothing sort of stereotyped or caricatural about this representation. A woman doing laundry, as you can see, it's very detailed, very carefully rendered. And the Negroes waiting at the depot, this reflects what was a common practice during the winter. Slaveholders would send their human property off to other plantations, perhaps, or to do other kinds of work before the planting season began. So these sketches were memory aids for paintings that Fuller hoped to create when he went back up north. And he had been inspired by the work of the French painter Edouard Frère, who specialized in sentimental, sort of realistic scenes of humble French peasant life, like the evening prayer that you see here. And Fuller aspired to do the same thing. He wanted to paint what he called Southern facts. And he would substitute enslaved Black people for French peasants. And he writes about studying Negro character and noted his appreciation of the slaves' body language. They had such unstudied attitudes. Their costumes were interesting, all of which, to quote him, he said, make them real prizes in an artistic way. Eastman Johnson, who was exactly Fuller's age, was working along the same lines when he resided in Washington, D.C. Around this time. As you can see by comparing these two examples, so I think you can kind of get the sense of how, these painters, these Americans, are sort of appropriating these conventions of French peasant painting and applying them to American, deep Southern scenes, so that the emphasis is not on oppression or misery or not being free, but rather on these intimate scenes of domestic life. Now, Fuller was anti-slavery. He thought it was a very bad cause, but at the same time, he's gathering this material for these paintings that he hopes to render and sort of kickstart his career. As he said, a new way in art for him, he hoped, would come from these observations. But this is the focus of our conversation today, the Negro Funeral, as Fuller called it, in this drawing that dates from late March 1858. And maddeningly, frustratingly, and unfortunately, he made no mention of this event in his diaries or letters home. There's just this drawing. We don't know where it was or how he came to see it. You can see he's standing at a distance and doing this very quick sketch to situate it in his memory, in his mind. And so you can see a few details. This presumably would be the wagon on which the coffin was transported to the gravesite. Over here, you can see people bent over headstones, and then there's this kind of undifferentiated crowd, just basically little thumbnail sketches of these people who are all huddled together. Now, this was a rare subject in American art at that time. It is seen very, very occasionally in painting, as in the English-born John Antrobus's painting and the illustration to the article on the bottom right there, The Rice Lands of the South, which appeared in Harper's Weekly magazine in 1859. The Antrobus painting is equally a mystery. It may indeed have been based on the engraving, the wood engraving you see from Harper's Weekly, and we don't know anything about how he came to paint it or if it was exhibited. It's in the historic New Orleans collection. But you can see what the details of the scene. Here's the preacher or the chief celebrant, people in attitudes of grief around the coffin where they're digging the grave, a kind of angry, sad-looking man leaning against a tree here. And just in the shadows, here are the white people looking on from a distance. And Frederick Law Olmsted, the designer of Central Park, described a funeral he had witnessed a few years earlier in Richmond, Virginia, when he was traveling through the South. He describes the gravesite as a desolate place beyond the main cemetery. And what struck him most powerfully was the call and response singing and chanting. And he wrote, the music was wild and barbarous, but not without a plaintive melody. A new leader took the place of the first man when his breath gave out, and continued until the grave was filled and a mound raised over it. And T. Addison Richards, the author of The Rice Lands of the South, He was also struck by the singing, and he noted that such funeral solemnities were typically celebrated in the deep night darkness of some dense old wood, made doubly visible by the ghostly light of the pine torches and the phantom-like figures of the scarcely visible mourners. So there was kind of an atmosphere to these funeral scenes that struck the sort of white observers as mysterious, ghostly, maybe even a little bit frightening, especially given the fact that they took place in these deep, dark woods at twilight or during the evening hours. So then we have this abrupt, hiatus in Fuller's career. His father died. After taking a trip to Europe, Fuller had to return and take over the family farm in Deerfield. He also married Agnes Higginson from Boston and painted on the side. But he was essentially out of the art scene until 1876, when he reemerged with an exhibition of 33 paintings at the Dahl and Richards Gallery in Boston. And he started exhibiting again at the National Academy of Design. And he began to win acclaim. His style, however, had changed radically. The 1855 Connecticut Valley on the top, it's basically a textbook example of Hudson River School style. That was the dominant landscape painting mode of the antebellum period, distinguished by its crispness and clarity and meticulous rendering of detail. Fuller's turkey pasture in Kentucky, on the other hand, as you can see, is broadly brushed, it's dim, it's highly atmospheric. There's kind of a dreamy quality to it, which can be attributed, at least in part, to the fact that, as with all his other paintings of remembered Southern subjects, it's something that comes out of his head. He wasn't observing this anymore. The sketches were being rendered in a very different manner. And that change in style can be attributed to the French Barbizon landscape painters, such as Theodore Rousseau, who sought to incorporate a romantic and emotional response to nature rather than a minutely descriptive catalog of things observed. And the Barbizon painters were avidly collected in Boston. As you can see, his landscape, Rousseau's landscape, is broadly brushed. There's sort of a feeling of tactility about it. And it conveys an effect of spontaneity and sort of a personal feeling. It's like this subjective reaction to the beauty and the colors and the light and the air that he's experiencing. So likewise in Fuller's turkey pasture, it's a memory picture, as I mentioned before, and here mood is more important than the description of facts. And before I go on, I have to say there's no record that Fuller went to Kentucky, but a couple of his paintings of this period seem to be set in kind of a Kentucky landscape. So that's another Fuller mystery. In all, Fuller produced 9 known paintings on Southern themes during this late period. And Winslow Homer, who was 14 years younger than Fuller, but also a Bostonian, also made one last trip to the South, or at least one last trip to the South in the mid-1870s to gather material for his own group of paintings depicting the scenes from the lives of former slaves. So Fuller, you might say, was on trend in his desire to represent his memories of the antebellum Southern plantation scene, which brings us at last to Negro Funeral, Alabama, as it's called, which to my knowledge was never exhibited during Fuller's lifetime. It's strikingly unlike the 1858 drawing in the sketchbook. It's a moody, even stormy spectacle of unleashed emotional abandon. The brushwork, as you can see, is energetic. Dim colors suggest that it's twilight. The atmosphere is somber, and yet there's this feeling of turbulence. It's like he's trying to paint the emotion. He's trying to convey something of the wildness of this scene, which he had not done in 1858 in that sketchbook drawing. So if we compare the sketchbook drawing and the Antrobus painting with Fuller's Negro Funeral, we can gauge the intensity of this emotional abandon. The grouping is similar in the Antrobus painting, down to the preacher or chief celebrant who's leading the chant or the song with his arms in the air, and giving way, to this grief and this chanting and the call and response. But I think you can see that whereas the figures in the Antrobus image seem stiff and posed and staged, in Fuller's painting they're only suggested. Their grief amplified by the dim tonalities and the stormy sky. I feel as if there's something even almost apocalyptic about the desolate landscape and the churning rhythms of the lowering sky. And even if you don't know the subject, you can kind of feel the vibe of tempestuous emotion. And there's a huddled crowd. Nobody is really distinguished or focused on in any particular way, except the central figure of the chief mourner or the preacher. And here you can see the coffin. But it's radically different from the 1858 sketch. Why did he paint it like this? Why did he paint it at all? And a possible answer lies in J.M.W. Turner's The Slave Ship. My colleague, Eric Rosenberg, who's a professor of American art history at Tufts University, theorizes that just possibly Fuller's Negro Funeral received inspiration from Joseph Mallord William Turner's epic painting, The Slave Ship, the full title being Slavers Throwing Overboard the Dead and Dying, Typhoon Coming On. And it's like this epic indictment of the slave trade and the cruelty. And in Turner's painting, all of nature seems to sort of be part of this terrible, tragic, deadly episode of human inhumanity and cruelty. You can see the legs and the shackles and the fish sort of coming for the bodies. From 1876 to 1878, Turner's painting was on view at the new Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. And given that Fuller had a studio in Boston at that time, and given the fact that Turner's painting excited a great deal of comment, there can be little doubt that Fuller saw it. And perhaps it jogged his memory of that time in Montgomery decades ago and put him in mind of the funeral he had sketched at that time. Negro Funeral is almost like the slave ship inside out, the column of light being replaced by the central tree in Fuller's painting. And the themes, in a sense, interlock. There are slaves, there's death, there's a stormy, foreboding atmosphere, and there's still a lot of mystery about the painting. It was never exhibited, to my knowledge, during his lifetime. Nobody talked about it, but it entered the collection of the Museum of Fine Arts in the late 19th century, where they have it hanging today. So if we ever get to Boston again, I hope to see it myself. And so that winds up my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention. And now I'll be able to see everybody.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Burns. You really added to our understanding with that background, and especially where this sits from your perspective in art history. I would like to note Dr. Burns' 1983 article in the American Art Journal titled Images of Slavery, George Fuller's Depiction of the Antebellum South, is a wonderful article for all of this information and more related to George Fuller. Thank you, Dr. Burns, and we'll have questions for you in just a moment. And now I'd like to introduce Ray Ratigan, who is sitting in Deerfield, Massachusetts right now. Welcome, Ray.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So I can talk a little bit about the Fuller collection as a whole. I will say, as I get my screen share going here, that I too have relied on Dr. Burns's article as I've been doing my own research on this. So I think my screen is being shared right now. So this is a Memorial Hall Museum here in Deerfield, Massachusetts. We're overseen by Pecumtuck Valley Memorial Association. We've been a museum and an organization since the 1870s, so very much contemporary. The founding was very much contemporary with George Fuller, whose house is, I don't know, probably about a mile and a half just down the road from us here. So we are fortunate to have in our collection not only a lot of the work of George Fuller, but really what we lovingly refer to as the Fuller family, which is at this point 5 or 6 generations, depending on how current you want to get, of Fuller family artists. So our collection here is our photo archives. So our collection, while it does obviously focus on these, the work of this wonderful family of artists, as a local and regional historical society, we're not limiting ourselves to being only an art museum. So we have so much more that relates to the family and really tells a, to make an unintentional pun, tells a fuller story. So our earliest Fuller works go back to Nathan Negus and the Negus family, who George was descended from. Nathan unfortunately died at a very young age in his early 20s, but we do have some early self-portraits of him. And I'm certainly not going to go through all of the works or all the artists, but just wanted to highlight a couple. And so when we get to George himself, not only do we have a lot of his work, but we do have many photographs in our collection of him. Even one, I believe this is the only one we have of him actually at his easel in his studio. And then we have some of his works, this, like Dr. Burns was talking about, how he did develop some of those sketches that we were looking at into finished oil paintings. A lot of these are ones you've already seen, so I don't want to harp on them, but we have a number of Fuller sketchbooks, not only George's, but also from a lot of other family members. And then we also have in our library a lot of Fuller family archival materials. This I grabbed a letter from George to his wife Agnes, but I think in total for our Fuller collection, between the museum and fine art side and the archives and library side, we have over 2,000 objects. So we are very fortunate to be able to tell what is, there's no such thing as a complete story because there's always more out there, but to be able to tell such a rich story. I mean, we even have things down to George Fuller's display easel. So it's a really great place to come and to really get to understand, if you're looking, you want to see the work, but to be able to see beyond that is really fantastic. And then we get into works of other Fuller family artists. All 5 of George and Agnes Fuller's children were artists as well. They not only inherited it from, their father, from the George Fuller side, but the Agnes Gordon Higginson side of the family was also notable artists in Boston, and many of them actually did come to Deerfield and work in the Deerfield area as well. So they really had the art influence from both sides of the family. This one is from their oldest son, George Spencer Fuller. We have a number of, he did a number of landscapes primarily. And I think what's interesting, you can see a lot of the landscapes focus on the farming aspect, because while they were successful artists, many of them, the rare successful in their own lifetime artists, they remained connected to the land to the point where they still continue to operate the family farm, even though for some of them at least, they were definitely making a living as artists. They continued to be active in farming as well and maintain that connection. Lucia Fairchild Fuller from the Boston Fairchild family was also, she married one of George and Agnes Fuller's sons, Henry Brown Fuller, and the two were both very accomplished artists. They were also connected with the Cornish colony up in Cornish, New Hampshire, with Maxfield Parrish and Auguste St. Gaudens. So they were very involved. She was most well known. Actually, it's funny because she became a very successful miniaturist throughout her artistic career. However, she got her start as a muralist, so really both ends of the extreme there. She was one of the 5 women selected to create murals for the 1893 Chicago World's Fair. The most notable of them was Mary Cassatt. And I think it's not only was she one of only 5 to create the murals, but I believe she was only 20 or 21 at the time she was chosen. So really a talent from a very young age. And Arthur Negus Fuller, the youngest of George and Agnes's children, a very prolific artist, a printmaker, did a whole bunch of landscape prints. So we are very fortunate to have a number of those in our collection. And then the one more artist, Elizabeth Brooks Fuller, the granddaughter of George Fuller, though she never actually met her grandfather. He had died before she was born. She really continued the tradition of landscape painting, maintaining the homestead and maintaining the farm here in Deerfield, which, by the way, is called the Bars Farm. So had her studio there for many years and was also very active in Memorial Hall Museum and our Pecumtuck Valley Memorial Association. And we're fortunate to have a lot of works by her, both finished works and sketches, studies, sketchbooks. One of the things that I think is really wonderful about the Fuller collection and about the collection here at Memorial Hall in general is that it's, I'd say, predominantly female-based artists. So to be able to have that gender balance is rare, and I think provides not only a measure of equity, but really a level of insight that we wouldn't otherwise have. And the Fuller family, I believe this is the last one I was going to mention here, not only includes those that are born Fullers, but those like Lucia who married into the family. And the most prominent of those is definitely Augustus Vincent Tack, who married Violet Fuller, who was George and Agnes's daughter. And Augustus Vincent Tack was an incredibly prolific artist in the early 20th century. And just in my own personal opinion, one of the most versatile artists I've ever seen. This is a painting of Elizabeth Brooks Fuller, the artist who did the previous landscape. So obviously a very accomplished portraiturist. He did portraits of everyone from Helen Keller to the Supreme Court of the United States, their official portraits. He maintained a very close correspondence with a number of people, including Harry Truman, who recognized him for his artistic accomplishments. But at the same time, he was also a very accomplished abstract painter. So he really spanned the gamut. And though he was not originally from Deerfield, once he married into the family, became based here in Deerfield and continued that Fuller family legacy, and really just helped to add to the story and add to the collection. So I'll believe that's the last one here. So I will stop my share now. And I mean, just to wrap up there, I think what's really incredible not only is the breadth of the artistic accomplishments of the number of people in this family. I mean, like I said, I was merely scratching the surface there with the handful that I selected, but to be able to have that all preserved and to have it be preserved so close to the landscape that so much of this is very heavily connected with, I think really not only lends to seeing the full picture of the family's work of art, but that element of connecting it to the landscape, which they very much were. And so, all of these materials are available. I think about 10% of them are on our website right now, and we're actually working to develop a new website and working with our collections database to get more of that online so it's accessible for researchers. But if anyone is in need of any research materials, you are obviously welcome to reach out. We'd like to make ourselves available as much as possible. So with that, I will turn it back over.
Thanks, Ray. That's a wonderful overview, and the images are striking. We really appreciate that. And we'll bring you back up in just a moment for some Q&A. I want to share an image of the drawing that is in Pebble Hill that was provided to us by Dr. David Robb. And you saw the earlier finished version of it at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. Have that there. We think it's unique for us to be able to have this, one, because it shows the artistic process, because it's a memory drawing, because it was, as David has told me, the first draft of what would become that important work. And so we also have a photograph of David Robb the day we've brought this piece home from Huntsville. And we look forward to a program in the future where we can interview David about his connection with that. But I will tell you that it was a gift to David and Frances as a wedding gift from Elizabeth Fuller, granddaughter of George Fuller. David had served as a fellow after he finished his undergraduate degree with the Pocumtuck Valley Memorial Association and Historic Deerfield Organization in Deerfield, Massachusetts, where one of his duties was to transcribe and organize the letters in the George Fuller collection. And so if anyone has participated in internships and fellowships, you never know what those will lead to. And of course, in this case, led to a lifelong connection with the family and with the work of George Fuller. And so Ray and Sarah, I'm going to bring you back up here just for a few questions while we have you. We really do appreciate, and we hope that that this video that we're creating right now will be useful in the future, hopefully to encourage studies in George Fuller and about George Fuller. And so I've got one question I want to ask you is that if there is more to discover, as you have shown, about George Fuller and his work and the context and the family, where do you think students should be putting their efforts in this? What's left to know about George Fuller? Dr. Burns, if you were to retake this study or extend this study, where would you go with it?
I would go a lot deeper, I think. He was a very prominent and much admired artist in New York and in particular in Boston after the Civil War. And I think he's one of the many victims of, like the modernist narrative. And he fell, by the wayside after his death. William Dean Howells admired him. That's another connection, a major American novelist. And I wrote about him from a particular angle in my dissertation. And then I did, a couple of articles, including the one about Fuller in the South. But I would really love to see some enterprising young scholar really looking comprehensively at his career and his importance. Because he was a figure of considerable stature in his day, and I'm still kind of puzzled about, why his work is so seldom seen in museums, for example. It doesn't get big prices on the art market. Not that that's a gauge of excellence necessarily, but I think that he needs to be brought out of the shadows and really looked at in a rigorous way.
Excellent, and we hope we can find some enterprising students who would like to take that on. Ray, what are your thoughts on that? And including, you mentioned Augustus Tack. And you spoke highly of Tack's work. Do you think there's room for a family history of artists? What are your thoughts?
I do. I mean, there's so many of them, and obviously, some of them were more successful in their own time. Some of them received more attention, after their time. Some of them pursued art, as their primary professional career. Others, it was more of a hobby. But to be able to see kind of the genesis of this one family, I mean, not unlike the name's escaping me from. Brandywine in Pennsylvania, having the same
Howard Pyle and all that,
yes,
Wyeth.
Yes, thank you. To be able to, have that same impact and see that, from one, relatively humble, small farming community comes this, this what I would consider to be, an artistic dynasty of, accomplished painters. And then bringing in not only having them, like I said, be born within the family, but having them marry into the family and really developing that connection in the art world, whether that's to the World's Fairs. They were involved in, I think, several of those. The Cornish colony, one of the best known artistic colonies in probably in American history, having direct connections to there. So they were definitely, like Dr. Burns was saying, they're under-recognized at the moment, but I think all of the material, no, I don't want to say all of the material, but enough of the material is there that if and when someone takes this on, I think there's a lot of, quality work and rich history behind that work that could be impactful and that could lead to understanding not only of them, but of the art world and, portions of American history beyond.
Excellent. Thank you. We're delighted to have this small drawing because it can be a window onto those larger conversations. And as we work to interpret the lives of those enslaved in and around this historic house from the 1840s and 50s, that we have something as a testimony to the cultural traditions of those enslaved. And so we are really delighted to have it. So as persons visit this historic house, and as we have, as you know, only a few seconds to tell someone about a particular object, what do you hope visitors, when they see this small drawing, what do you hope that they take away as a result of their visit? Dr. Burns?
Well, I hope it would turn on a light bulb in their head, because you visit a historic house and, they're very interesting and wonderful and full of fascinating history. And yet I think the Fuller drawing in this particular environment, in this context, is something that should pop out as, like, oh, even though it's a memory drawing, it's in a sense, it's very expressive and not particularly descriptive, but the subject matter alone, I think, it's almost like a little bit of transgression, in the sort of dignified historic house. And then you've got this drawing of something that happened, something that he saw, that he remembered. That's a very different landscape. It's the landscape of slavery. And I think I would hope that it would jog some, maybe some reflection, as well as, ignite some interest in that history.
Excellent. We hope so as well. Thank you for those words. Ray, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree. I think just by the act of it being hung there, I think we are adding ourselves into that story by elevating the story of those who are enslaved in whatever way we can, and saying that, we have this, wonderful, historic location here, and there's all this history, and this is of equal importance, even though during their own time these people were clearly marginalized and not valued. Now we can look back and say, with our own 21st century values, we understand that these were individual peoples. They had customs, they had obviously all the same feelings and emotions as everyone else from their time period. And even though there's little historical record and little physical record of who these people were and what they did, what they believed, how they felt, how they acted, what we do know, we are going to try to elevate because we understand the importance of it and the value of it.
Well said. Thank you for that. And we hope that both of you, as you travel to the Deep South sometime soon, we hope that you will come by and visit us at Pebble Hill so that we can show our appreciation to you in person for today. Thank you. You've given us wonderful information. You've hopefully ignited the passion of future researchers who will come visit the collection in Deerfield. And we know about George Fuller, mostly Dr. Burns, because of your work, and we thank you.
Well, my pleasure.
Thanks so much.